Ahoy! The recent balance patch came with a change to Shirking Fortification, buffing that back up a little bit. And now a lot of people are wondering if it's now better to run Shirking Fortification or still stick to Elemental or Physical Aversion and how they compare against each other. And that is exactly what we're going to talk about today. So there's two factors that we have to consider here. The first one are the adjustments to armor, which are just slight increases to armor in medium and in heavy. We'll see the actual values in a second. Along with that, we of course have to consider the Shirking Fortification buff itself. It says here that this buff is from 3.9 to 4.7%, but if we look at 625 gear score, this is actually closer to 4.9% per armor piece. If you're completely out of the loop, Fortify was changed recently, so it now scales with your armor, meaning this value is generally lower than the reduction we get from Elemental Aversion, which is a 3.9 base damage reduction. So what does this really mean for the damage that we're taking? First of all, I'd like to thank XR and Jescapades, who has a wonderful house in Brimstone, for the work on these spreadsheets, on this data. They're the ones who were digging all this up and figuring out how exactly this works with all of the factors that you could think of. This also means that they tested a ton of different scenarios and we can't look at all of them in detail here. So if you want to look at any of the numbers more closely, then feel free to pause the video at some of these spreadsheets that I'm going to show. I will focus on the more simplistic side so that we actually get a good comparison. There are many other alternative options that you can also look at that generally have similar results though. So here are the scenarios we're going to compare. First we have Elemental Aversion, but on the current patch with the new heavy and medium armor values as well. You can see these new values here. We have a 19.5% base damage reduction if we run 5 Elemental Aversion. We don't have any Fortify and we are not including any gems here. But if you include gems, the value shifts the same way for all of them, so that doesn't really matter unless you run specific gem loadouts that are different between the different tests that you want to run. But that's a more in-depth scenario again that we're not going to discuss here because it just wouldn't really fit into all of the things that we're talking about today. For now, all you need to know is that if you're, for example, running 4 Onyxes instead, the result would still be the same for all of these. What you can see here next is our effective health if the person attacking us is light. The loadout makes some difference in base damage, so it is relevant what loadout the enemy is in. We are focusing on just a few examples though. We have ourselves in light armor and medium armor and heavy armor, and we can see the relative health here. So for example, if our attacker is in light and we are in light, then we'd be taking 17,781 damage. This scenario only applies as long as the attacker's damage is elemental range damage that is affected by Elemental Aversion. Otherwise, we won't have this damage reduction. We'll look at that a little bit later. Likewise, you can also see the higher effective health values if the attacker is in medium, or even higher if they're in heavy, because they deal less damage to you. Now, this is just a scenario for a balanced armor loadout where you have equal physical and elemental armor. However, you can have skewed armor, you can have weighted armor that has more physical armor, for example. These are the scenarios here for high and low, where you have one side that has more armor and one side has less armor. As you can see, the shifts are quite dramatic in some ways, but that is to be expected. That is just how it works. So that's why a lot of people still like to run weighted armor as well, to kind of counter both. If you run physically weighted armor with Elemental Aversion, you can counter a lot of different kinds of damage. Our next scenario is Shirking Fortification before the buff, though we are using the armor values from the new patch here. They are just slightly higher. This one we don't need to look into in detail because it's just a small comparison point. What is important to note here is that you can see the 2% base damage. Instead of having a base damage reduction like we do with Elemental Aversion, we actually take more base damage from the enemy if they have Invigorated Punishment on their ring. Most people do in PvP, so we're using this as a general assumption here. So if you're wondering if Invigorated Punishment is included against the Fortify, then yes, it is. It's right here. And it is just one stack, because even if you have 5 stacks of Fortify, they're all stacking on top of each other as one buff when it's Shirking Fortification, so you only get 1 stack of Invigorated Punishment. Again, you can see all the values here, but what's more important for us is the next one, which is the new value for Shirking Fortification. Now we're at 24.3%. And we can see some shifts in the effective health that we're taking. We're going to look at them in comparison in just a second, so you don't need to memorize these numbers. The last scenario here is not having Shirking Fortification or Elemental Aversion active. So this is, for example, what would happen if you are fighting an enemy that is using physical melee damage or physical range damage while you're running Elemental Aversion. You're not getting that extra reduction, you're just taking the normal damage. By the way, all these calculations also factor in the 200 con bonus, which slightly increases your armor. Now let's look at a few scenarios in comparison, starting with effective health. We'll also look at some percentages. So, for example, if our attacker is light, as many attackers are, and often light attackers are the biggest threat, though in wars it can sometimes be medium, and we are wearing light armor. If we have no perks at all or elemental aversion and the attacks are physical, then our effective health is 14,842, so roughly 15,000. If the attacker's damage, however, is elemental and affected by elemental aversion, which not all abilities are, but most are, then we get the higher reduction from elemental aversion included, which makes the total effective health 17,800. Shirking Fortification doesn't need this qualifier regarding the type of damage, it reduces everything, but on the other hand it needs the qualifier of you dodging an attack first. In Shirking Fortification's case, on the old patch your effective health would have been roughly 15,400, whereas on the new patch is roughly 15,600. In my opinion, looking at this value and the conditions required to trigger it, at this point I would already say elemental aversion in light is definitely more effective than Shirking Fortification, and I would definitely prefer elemental aversion in this particular scenario. I'm also not opposed to physical aversion here if you're heavily getting focused by bows, for example, but there are other ways to do that. You can do that through thrust protection or physically weighted armor as well. We'll talk more about some details at the end, but let's look at medium armor in comparison first. Here, when getting attacked by someone in light armor, our effective health would be 18,300 without any perks. With elemental aversion, it would be nearly 22,000. With Shirking Fortification, it would be around 19,500 on the old patch, and is now 19,900. But these are big numbers and I often find that difficult to put into perspective. I'm going to show you the full table again, but I want to show you some percentage differences, which I find much easier to comprehend and get into a better frame. So the first comparison is just the advantage that elemental aversion has over Shirking Fortification in a scenario where we're taking elemental damage. Here you can, for example, see in the scenario that we looked at before, with the attacker being light and us being light, the disadvantage of Shirking Fortification on the new patch would be 12.16%. That is still a pretty big amount. In medium it would be 9.39%, and in heavy it would be 7.8%. So you can see that the higher we go in armor, the more value we get out of Shirking Fortification. Not really surprising. However, if we look at a medium attacker, then you can see that the advantage of elemental aversion goes up, and it goes up even further if we're looking at a heavy attacker, because those don't have the same base damage increase from being in light equip load or in medium equip load if you're in heavy, so you are going to take significantly less damage in those scenarios. But let's move to yet another comparison that I personally find the easiest to understand, because it gives us a very clear picture of how the different types of damage reduction currently work. This is the percentage difference versus nothing. So the percentage difference versus not having elemental aversion and not having Shirking Fortification, as it for example would be the case with elemental aversion when hit by physical damage. In this scenario, compared to having nothing, elemental aversion, for example in light, takes 19.8% less damage. This time the old Shirking Fortification values are not included, and we're just directly looking at the new ones for this patch, because that is what's really important for us. In comparison here, the new Shirking Fortification value is a 5.23% damage reduction. Again, Shirking Fortification is against all types of damage that are coming your way. In medium, we have this 20% on elemental aversion and 8.83% on Shirking Fortification. In heavy, we have 19.42% versus 10.10%. Again, this gap gets larger if the attacker is in medium. For example, if we are in medium as well, you can see we have 22.26% damage reduction in elemental aversion and 8.67% in Shirking Fortification. I once again show you the full tables here, but overall these values are relatively comparable, because when something goes low, it goes low on both ends. So when something goes high, it goes high on both ends as well. But what does that mean for us? If we assumed that all damage in New World was equally split, and we take an equal amount of melee physical damage, ranged physical damage, melee elemental damage, and ranged elemental damage, this will look really good for Shirking Fortification. You'd essentially have to divide the value of elemental aversion by 4 to determine its total effectiveness, and in that regard, Shirking Fortification would just win. Unfortunately for Shirking Fortification, that is not the case. A lot of the damage, especially at the moment, due to the popularity of Fire Staff and Ice Gauntlet, is elemental, and even some melee attacks, technical melee attacks, are elemental, like for example Grafwell, which is a huge source of damage in many PvP scenarios. Problem number 2 for Shirking Fortification is that it is Shirking Fortification. You need to dodge an attack for it to happen. You won't always be able to dodge an attack. You may not be willing to sacrifice your dodge just to get Shirking Fortification because you need to dodge something more important after. There are many scenarios where you simply won't be able to get Shirking Fortification to avoid the damage that you want to reduce the most. This is something that can't be calculated accurately because it depends on your playstyle, your role, your positioning and everything else, but generally speaking you can't expect near 100% uptime even. And on that topic you also have to consider there's another problem with Shirking Fortification, which is that it can be stripped from you, for example, by a nullifying Oblivion. As such, the first thing I suggest you consider is what you actually want to use the gear for. For example, in Arena, I would say there is very, very limited potential in Shirking Fortification just based on how dodges and everything are going there and what they're used for. You kind of use them primarily to avoid big CC. Though at the same time in Arena there's a bigger chance of having a matchup with maybe just 2 melees where Elemental Aversion won't really do that much for you, and then a healer along with that or something like that. So in that case you kind of would only really make use of Shirking Fortification because Elemental Aversion is just not going to do much for you. But then ideally you have your gear set up in a way where you are getting good physical reduction along with the Elemental Aversion anyways, and then that shouldn't be a concern. So I think in most scenarios in Arena you're probably going to look for Elemental Aversion or Physical Aversion, with some outlier cases. In OPR, I see fairly limited use in Shirking Fortification as well. OPR is the high ground of archers and mages, so you will see a lot of bows, a lot of fire staffs, and that's exactly where Elemental Aversion and Physical Aversion shine. Those hits are often not avoidable, you often can't see them coming, and in the clump on the point, if that's even happening in the first place, you may get some more benefit out of shirking, but overall, most of the damage sources will usually be elsewhere, unless you play on a server where OPR is for some reason super bruiser heavy. The only place where I think the numbers that we have here are closer to actually reflecting reality in terms of Shirking Fortification uptime are in a war. And by extension of that, also other scenarios with big group fights, for example, if you're contesting a territory. In those situations, you can reach good uptime on Shirking Fortification, both while in medium or heavy armor, because there's a good chance that if you're dodging, someone was trying to hit you somehow anyways. Here it is also less of a concern for heavy stamina management, because in heavy you don't necessarily dodge all that much depending on how exactly you're playing. But even then I urge you to consider what is attacking you in a clump like that. You will probably get hit by some melee attacks that will likely utilize a weapon with an elemental gem, so it's going to be a physical and melee elemental split. That is probably your weakest point. The elemental split in particular is going to be fairly difficult to counter with Elemental Aversion specifically because it's not affected by it. But the Graph-Well is reduced, the Fire Mage or Ice Mage hitting you is reduced, and that is a lot of the damage that you're going to take. There is going to be more damage, there are going to be bows hitting you, maybe there are going to be other melee weapons hitting you, there are maybe Void Blades hitting you. In that case run, because those are probably your biggest enemy if you're running more physical weighted armor. But all of these factors are probably around 50-50 in terms of damage, especially because the damage dealers are the ones that have magical damage, the mages are the ones that have very high damage, and that results in even the values in heavy here, in my opinion, not necessarily favoring Shirking Fortification. You have to get a very consistent uptime and get hit by the right attacks essentially for Shirking Fortification to actually go even or pull slightly ahead. In most scenarios, for most players that don't iframe every attack perfectly, I would say generally Elemental Aversion, or maybe Physical Aversion depending on what you need, is going to be the safer and more effective bet. Shirking Fortification in medium or heavy isn't inherently bad, and if you get a good piece, there is no reason not to equip it if you don't have anything better for that slot already. The problem that Invigorated Punishment would ruin all of that is vastly overstated. It makes around a 1% difference, so that's not your big problem. But if you made a good set last patch, I don't think you will need to replace anything. In light, I would definitely not recommend Shirking Fortification. In medium, very few scenarios where I'd say maybe you can slot it, but even then I don't think I would go for full shirking, I would just maybe get 1 or 2 pieces. In heavy, again, I don't think it is that useful because you're not dodging nearly as much as someone in medium, and having that consistent damage reduction is much better, and being able to block and use your stamina for that, also better in my opinion. So I would take a different angle here, and if you're using Sword and Shield, then you can get the block perk that gives you fortification anyways, don't need to sacrifice any aversion for that. If you want some more specific advice about how you want to weigh your armor, what gems you want to slot, what amulet you want to use and so on, I made a video about that in the last patch that is still very much up to date because I think these changes haven't really affected what I said there in any regard. So I will link that right here and you can dig deeper into what exactly you want to gear for with the things you're looking for, keeping in mind that maybe if you find a piece with Shirking Fortification you can throw it in now because it doesn't make a big bad difference or anything. If you're interested in a mutation guide or some tips for the new event, then consider subscribing and clicking the bell because those things are coming in the next days. Thanks again to XR and Jazz for doing these calculations. You can find the link to XR's Twitch down below. As usual, if you have any questions, please write them in the comments. Don't send them direct messages or ask them about access to the spreadsheet or similar. Now that I've helped you save some gold, I have some tips how to turn that into more gold with the next patch. If you're interested in that, consider supporting me on Patreon, where I post early trading tips. Thanks to my patrons who already do exactly that, and thank you for watching. SLOTH, out.